There is a growing trend among historians to take filmic depictions of the past more seriously, and analyze the ability of such films to represent history successfully. However, given the novelty of this trend, there does not appear to be a consensus among historians, or even explicit areas of focus with which to judge the successful representation of history on film. The Way Back, written and directed by Peter Weir, and loosely based on the memoir of Slavomir Vich, depicts the struggle of 8 prisoners, later joined by a young girl, on their journey to freedom, having escaped from a Siberian gulag in 1942. This videocast will attempt to engage with the emerging debate concerning history on film, utilizing The Way Back as the case in point. In order to understand whether The Way Back presents a successful representation of history, the criteria which it must or should fulfill has to be defined. Historians can often be critical and dismissive of history on film, exemplified in the view of Francois Delabouteque, who believes that films can never adequately represent history. This is, for example, because of film's tendency to distort the truth, invoke anachronism, simplify complex historical events by turning away from the analytical, and frequently revert to fabrication in the interests of dramatic effect. Bouteque is particularly critical of the way filmmakers are more concerned with creating visual verisimilitude than with historical representation and accuracy. For example, in The Way Back, Peter Weir makes use of epic and picturesque scenery which both creates a lasting feeling of the vastness of nature that lies before the escapees, and evokes a sense of reality among the viewers. The issue, then, is a matter of deception. Mark Carnes asserts that an audience will often take the view that if a film resembles the past visually, it is therefore just like the past. The filmmaker is, then, uncritically charging their historical movies with authority and truth. However, all such perceived failures are concluded by historians with implicit reference to what would be considered a serious misuse of history within their own academic profession. Hayden White claims that there is no reason why a filmed representation of historical events should not be as analytical and realistic as any written account. But essentially this misses the point. That is, film does not and should not have to produce equivalents of written history. Even when historians accept that history on film can embellish the story to a certain degree, many still insist that historical figures and events should not be changed for dramatic purposes. Such approaches demonstrate the lack of understanding of the medium exhibited among scholars. Rather than take this narrow view, historians need to understand film as a medium in its own right and therefore judge it by its own terms. The lack of understanding and confusion surrounding history on film is exemplified in Mark Carnes' book, Past Imperfect, whereby the contributors continually point out the contrast between historical fact and Hollywood fiction. If written history were to employ the methods used by filmmakers, such as fabrication, it would be seen as particularly poor historical work, or even barely history at all. However, they are in fact an indispensable aspect of film. Furthermore, historical film is a cinematic genre in itself, with its own conventions, trends, and traditions which change over time, just as written history does. The criticisms aimed at historical films lose much of their force if it is acknowledged that history on film is merely engaging in its own generic conventions and has its own essential criteria to comply with. Film, then, is capable of representing the past, but essentially it does this in a different way to written history. Often historians feel that something is lost when history is transferred to the screen. Principles such as accuracy of detail, complexity, historical reflection, and a multidimensional presentation of critical interpretations. Thus, historians tend to focus on the shortcomings rather than the benefits of history on film and its ability to present a historical discourse. In analysing the representation of history in The Way Back, it is evident that film often has an entirely different aspect of history to present to the public. In this case, Peter Weir's film could be described as an essentially affective film, in that it focuses on the emotion and feelings embedded in that particular historical context. The characters appear to be considerably underdeveloped and often interchangeable as the film goes on. Thus, Weir detaches the audience from many of the characters in order to place emphasis on the central message, emotions, and meaning of his representation of the story. In addition, he does not embellish the film with typical Hollywood drama. In fact, as commentators have noted, nothing much actually happens. This may also testify to Weir's unwavering attention to the emotional aspect of the story. He wants his audience to understand both the injustice of the historical event and the courage that it would have taken to escape from the Gulag into what is described as their real prison, nature. He further attempts to engage the audience in the sheer determination mustered to continue on such a journey, as well as the strength to survive provided by human kindness and the human spirit. However, there is a fundamental issue with The Way Back. Historians have all but disregarded Rawicza's story, claiming that he may have taken it from some official records he had access to at the Polish embassy in London. It is likely, though, that someone did embark on such a journey, and this is further confirmed by British intelligence officer Rupert Mayne, who was in India at the time and interviewed 3 men who claimed to have escaped from Siberia. Given that the details are somewhat ambiguous and no one knows who the story belongs to, it may seem perhaps irresponsible for Peter Weir to explicitly present the film as based on a true story. This is more surprising given his characteristically strong commitment to historical accuracy and detail. However, Weir intelligently safeguards his representation of the story against these issues. First of all, he distances the film drastically from the book, replacing all but one character name and inventing his own biographies of each character based on oral testimonies. He also appears to employ a theatrical concept known as everyman. Since the characters are not distinctive and barely possess any individuality, they are representative of all or any of the many prisoners who escaped the Siberian gulags. Though the events along the way cannot be verified, the story is historically true in a metaphorical way. Therefore it stands in for many individual historical moments, depicting the emotions, struggles, and dilemmas facing all those who attempted to and did escape the Gulag, either dying along the way or managing to achieve freedom. Robert Rosenstone highly praises films which discard typical Hollywood dramatic techniques and fictionalizations. The Way Back certainly fits into this category, playing down the tension that could have been introduced, even barely making use of dramatic music. However, in doing this, The Way Back also seems to have sacrificed one of the key elements of film: popular entertainment. Many reviewers felt that the film would have been much more popular if it had introduced some dramatic conflict, and in the words of Roger Ebert, a bit of vulgarity would have helped. There is certainly a conflict between the intentions and demands made of film and those made of history. Though some films may find a common ground which can adequately satisfy both the requirements made of film and those made of history, this is certainly uncommon and not a central concern for many filmmakers. The problem is that even the most tolerant historians still fail to understand that by its nature, history on film is more likely to satisfy the needs of film before those of history. For example, though Rosenstone argues for film to be seen as a legitimate medium in its own right, when theorizing about what makes the most successful history on film, he still put forward a view which would have film depict history in a way which conforms to certain aspects of academic history, essentially that historical films should present multiple meanings of history. Fundamentally, the comparison between history and film is nonsensical. As Mark Kahn says, sometimes films do history well, and sometimes they don't. The point is that the film industry has entirely different intentions and motives than do historians. Directors and filmmakers will create historical films in such a way as to compromise between the various requirements of the profession. However, more than likely, though not always, they will neglect historiographical concerns in favour of filmic considerations, and for good reason. As The Way Back exhibits, when a director dispenses with mainstream techniques and depictions, though the film may make good history, it often does not make particularly popular film.